Shi-Huo slumped down into the tavern seat with a put-upon sigh, uncaring of the racket made by his armor, as he loosened the shoulder straps, allowing them to clatter to the floor. None of the other patrons of his favorite tavern even glanced up as he casually battered the loose bits of armor under the table with his feet. Nor did they look up as his compatriots joined him, repeating his actions. Their table was far from the only one with shoulder pauldrons gathered beneath it. It was a favoured hangout for the Sect guard of the Brazen Claw. "So, we're to be rebels now?" His compatriots grunted quietly, as the tavern owner's daughter placed mugs before each of them, without a need for prompting on any of their parts. "Not just rebels," Xing Zong muttered quietly. "Part of the Grand Army of Tenhuo besides." He spat to the side. "If I had wanted to spend my days gallivanting across the country fighting bandits and instinctive tribesmen, I'd have joined the Imperial Army." She shrugged as he took a sip of his drink. "Well, it seems we've not much choice in the matter now." "Aye," Xing nodded. "That we don't." Such was the life of a mortal in Tenhuo. Cultivators made decisions, and it was the mortals who had to live with the consequences. It wasn't like any of them would dream of quitting their jobs, throwing off their colours and disappearing into one of the city's many back alleys. And gain what work, she thought. The merchant caravans are basically a death sentence. The nearest farms are abandoned. Fishing boats have all but stopped going out since they started being attacked by sharks. Empress above, even the gangs have gone quiet as of late. No. As unpalatable as this latest change was to him, he knew that the alternatives were worse. The 4 men and 1 woman sat in silence, each sipping their drinks, as they mulled over their worries. "Do you think we'll get guns?" Joanne finally asked, glancing up from her drink. "Johansson's guards have guns." "They call themselves the militia," Xing corrected, though he did not move to correct her otherwise. "Guns," Tian breathed. "That'd be a thought." The weapons had achieved a near mythical status amongst the mortals of the city during the siege. Mythic tools that might allow a dozen mortal men and women to stand toe-to-toe with a cultivator. Sure, the Brazen Claw had some of their own. Fire Lancers, they were called. But they were reserved for the Sect's elite mortal troops. Not the street sluggers like him and his friends. "Forget that!" The thus far silent Zhou snapped at them. "You all realize that we're rebels now. Dissidents!" Tian glanced at his friends before they all mutually shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." Tian leaned back in his seat. "I mean, not for us, obviously, but my granddad was around back when the whole Northern Independence movement was going strong." Indeed. He was pretty sure the old man would have been hooting and hollering with glee at the thought of Tenhuo trying for independence once more, if the cold hadn't taken him a few winters past. Still, lots of the city's older crowd would no doubt be waxing poetic about the new magistrate taking the city back to its golden years. Personally, Tian was dubious this wouldn't all turn out the same way it had for them, with the rebel leaders all rounded up and their closest family lines forced to face decimation. Well, with the exception of the former leader herself, Tian thought. I mean, you can hardly decimate the Imperial family for one of its members rebelling against the Imperial family. Though, wasn't the former magistrate now part of Johansson's inner circle? She was an Imperial. So was she a hostage or a collaborator? And now that he thought about it, hadn't he heard some chatter about her losing her powers? He vaguely recalled some chatter about that back when they were running the Imperial army out of the city. Or rather, back when the Sect's heavy hitters had been doing that. He and his squad had spent the entire conflict guarding a checkpoint near the wall. The closest they'd come to seeing any of the fighting had been when they'd heard gunfire going off near the Imperial Palace for a few evenings. The whys hadn't really mattered. That sort of thing was for cultivators. Mortals like him just did as they were told. Which, while sometimes annoying, also meant that they usually avoided the fallout that came with those decisions. His granddad had certainly fought for the rebels during the Northern War of Independence, yet he'd not been punished for it. He'd just missed out on some of his pay and been re-inducted into the Guard when the Imperial Army rolled back into the city. Oh, certainly there'd been a few hangings of mortal officers, but that was to be expected. Appearances needed to be kept. "Granddad was fine," he said philosophically. "Just do as you're told. Don't talk too much and hope it works out for the best. And if it doesn't, just shut up and get ready to surrender when things start looking dicey." Zoe looked at him in disgust, but the rest of the table nodded along in agreement. "So, guns?" Xuan ventured again. "And silver. Specifically more silver, because I've heard the militia gets paid 4 silver a week." "4 silver a week? Someone's having you on." "No, I'm serious. And 1 more besides if they see any actual fighting." "Horse shit. I bet you'll..." This time it was Tian who interrupted, clearing his throat as he posed the other question that had been bothering him since he sat down. "Before all that, do you think the Sect will actually hand us over?" Sure, the Sect didn't actually care for him and his, but in his experience, cultivators never backed down on anything without a fight. Zoe scoffed. The man had finally realized that no one else shared his patriotic outrage at Tenhuo's rebellion, and was munnishly nursing his drink. "You seen any Silver Paw Sect members wandering around recently? If they didn't put up a fight over Johansson turning the whole city against the Empire, I don't think they're going to put up much of a fight over him taking a bunch of mortals from them." None of them had much of an argument against that. As soon as they were back at the compound, Jack tossed his new ornate scepter over to Ren, who only barely caught it, which said a lot about how surprised she was by what was essentially a key to the city's more mystic defenses. Of course, normally, in the hands of anyone who the weapon was not keyed for, it was just a big paperweight. "What?" the merchant started to say, before trailing off as her eyes became momentarily glassy. This is keyed to me." "Surprise!" Jack sing-songed, as the seals of his armor cracked open with a hiss, before unfolding like a flower, allowing him to step out. "Surprise!" Ren murmured quietly to herself, before rounding on him with a complicated expression. "This is a rod of control. Whoever holds it may as well hold the city." She eyed him. "Why is it keyed to me?" Jack scratched the back of his neck. Yeah. The artificer in charge of carving the rod hadn't been happy about Jack's request for that small alteration. At first he'd refused politely. Jack had politely requested he reconsider. The artificer had refused again, impolitely that time. At which point Jack had made the request again, impolitely. The other man had then acceded to the miner's wishes. Benefits of destroying the equivalent of 2 sects simultaneously, I suppose, Jack thought. Fortunately, aside from Ren, no one else seemed too bothered by this new development. Elwyn was already following the members of the newly established Steel Paw down into Jack's workshop, which was probably for the best. While he had some assurances against poor behaviour on the part of his newly acquired band of cultivators, that didn't mean he trusted them. And Arn... "I don't know about that," Ann opined, as she rather casually dug her little finger into her ear canal, wiggling it back and forth in a rather unladylike manner. "The old magistrate had one, and she still lost a shitty." Ren whirled on her fellow cultivator. "After she lost the ability to cultivate, which would have rendered the city's internal defences useless to her." Defences that were, to hear them described to him, pretty potent. The protections surrounding the walls are among the least of the tools available to an Imperial magistrate. Once an attacking force penetrated deeper into the city, it was possible to summon phantasmal spirit beasts, activate anti-cultivator traps, and bring down precision lightning strikes. Potent stuff, Jack thought. Stuff that might have come in handy in the minutes immediately preceding the Red Death's arrival. Unfortunately, not only were most of those defenses located around the Imperial Palace, the one person capable of activating and controlling those defenses had been busy fighting said dragon herself, rather than directing the city's ancient weapon systems. Ren continued, gripping the rod in her hand so tightly, Jack was actually a little worried she'd snap it. If Lady Huang had still been capable of utilizing her control rod, the success of Tian's coup would not have been nearly so assured, even after her erstwhile bodyguards abandoned her. Sounds useful, Anne hummed, before her gaze slid over to him. So why are you handing it off to the dog? Sure, the little black-haired Tiger Kim was trying to sound nonchalant, but Jack could detect just a hint of jealousy and avarice in her gaze now. He sighed. Because Ren spent the last few weeks trying to run the city. Sure, she's got Huang helping now, but it's still ultimately been her work. She's the one I trust most with anything city-related. Even as Ren puffed up, Anne seemed to deflate slightly, as if in recrimination. She tried to help with the more bureaucratic side of Tenhuo's administration for a little while, before it became abundantly clear that her total lack of familiarity with administration in general, and the political makeup of the city specifically, meant she was causing more harm than good. Enough so that I'm reasonably certain she had someone else helping her set up Jiangxi in my absence, Jack thought. Because if not, well, I shudder to think of how much of a mess the place must be. He said none of that, though. It's not a slight, he added quickly, attempting to cheer the cat up. You've been just as busy working with Gao to set up and integrate the Jiangxi militia in the city, and I'm sure you'll be even more busy trying to integrate the Sect forces into the new Tenhuo army. Anne seemed to perk up at that, tail fluttering about behind her back even as she stifled a smile. Still, Master, I have to ask, why bother with this delegation in the first place? Ren asked quietly. It's a not insubstantial break in tradition. And while I am 100% loyal, others might see it as a weakness in the security of your role should they learn that it is I, not you, who holds the reins of the city's defences. Well, ideally no one will ever know, Jack responded easily. And as to why, well, you said it yourself about a minute ago. Things went to shit for Huan because she was both the city's most powerful defender and the person in charge of directing those defences. Jack tapped one of the thrusters on his suit with the back of an oversized knuckle. I don't intend to hamstring myself like that. It was An who finally got it. You intend to repeat what you did in Jiangxi across the province? Build more edifices, summon more spirit beasts, put the mortals to work? Jack nodded, glad to see that one of his followers got it. Exactly. I can't afford to spend all my time in Tenhuo. That fortress I'll be building on our northern border is just one example of the kind of projects that might take me out of the city for days at a time. Ren nodded. And you do not wish to leave the city defenseless in your absence? Well, I wouldn't say the city was defenseless even without the defense matrix, but essentially yes, he acknowledged. It took him a while to realize both women were staring at him. So beneficent, Ren finally muttered, as she fell seamlessly and gracefully to one knee. To focus on the well-being of the province as a whole, even over your own personal power. The blonde dogkin stared up at him, eyes burning with an earnestness that made him mildly uncomfortable, which was ironic given that once upon a time he dreamed of being worshipped as some manner of living god.
This Stellan Wren shall strive to prove to you that your act of faith and selflessness was no mistake. So she swears.
Jack could only nod mutely, as he realized that Arn had likewise taken a knee. That's good. He spent a moment searching for the proper response to this unexpected show of enthusiasm. See that you do. A little gruff, but it sounded appropriate.
Of course,
Wren nodded eagerly, as if she'd just had some manner of holy mission bestowed upon her. It almost made Jack feel bad that the two main reasons he'd foisted the control rod off onto her were because he was almost entirely sure the thing wouldn't work for him, and he didn't want to be cooped up in the city all the time, like some oversized guard dog. Well, I guess it's good that Wren's happy about it, he thought. Still, this seemed like the most ideal moment to slip away. Right, he said, shifting slowly towards the door. With that done, I'm sure we all have a lot of work to do. Arn has army stuff, Wren has city stuff. I need to check in with Elwyn. Both women nodded eagerly, showing not a hint of aggravation at the veritable shitload of problems he just offloaded onto them.
Of course, Great One,
Wren smiled happily. Arn just nodded, slowly.
I've got it handled.
He certainly hoped so, because he'd be totally lost if either of them didn't. Not least of all because I'm pretty sure Gal would kill me if I attempted to foist off any more work onto him. As Jack strode through the halls towards Lynn's quarters, he watched for his tablet as Elwyn fussed over the newly formed steel paw. A name about as subtle as the moniker itself, where the origins of the unit were concerned, given that they were made up of survivors of the now defunct Silverpaw Sect. Cultivators that had been outside the compound when he'd levelled it. Now, he'd been aware that the attack would leave survivors. Counted on it, even. He'd expected them to see which way the wind was blowing and leave town as quickly as possible. Or be gunned down assaulting his compound in some futile attempt at getting revenge. He'd been leaning towards the former outcome, though. That was usually what happened with a rival gang, once you'd broken up the core membership. They hadn't done that, though. Or at least some of them hadn't. Instead, they'd shown up on his doorstep begging for mercy. Mercy which he'd granted, after a fashion. His eyes tracked to the nearest member of the group, as she took off her tiger mask helmet, unveiling a fuzzy pair of tiger ears, and a mark on her neck. The old explosive chip special, he thought, a complicated expression flashing across his features. As he watched, Elwyn all but grabbed the muscular tigerkin on screen. The slight elf was utterly ignorant, or perhaps uncaring, of the way the bigger woman practically snarled at her, instead focusing on the runes engraved in the woman's pauldron. One of which was visibly flickering, the low blue light weak and inconsistent. "Whoa!" Elwyn shouted. "The buffer in this enchantment is failing. I could hear this one's armor clinking as she walked in here." "This one has a name," the tigerkin muttered sullenly. Elwyn ignored her, turning instead towards the sheepish-looking dogkin woman that appeared on screen. She wore robes, much like most cultivators Jack had met, but they were of a distinctly different bent, more European than Asian. That was not to say it didn't have Asian elements, it certainly did, but it was clear that Elwyn had a part in designing the uniforms of her apprentices. "This one apologizes, mistress," the dogkin bowed. "This one thought the Matrix would hold." Elwyn snorted in a manner that somehow managed to be graceful, while still conveying the utmost disdain. "No, you hoped it would hold." A single delicate finger pointed to the offending piece of armor. "Magisters do not hope. They know. Why is that, woah?" The young woman shuffled uncomfortably. "Because
Unreliable spellwork is a blade without a handle. Precisely.
Elwyn turned to where Jack assumed her other apprentices were standing.
Now, because Wu thought you could get away with subpar work, I can only assume others amongst you feel similarly.
She received no reply in response, from the still undressing members of the Iron Paw, or her apprentices.
As a result, you shall all be redoing these runes in their totality. And if I find even one weight reduction enchantment or rust resistance rune that is not up to my standards, you shall be wiping them and doing them again. Maybe use the laser-cutting artifact for the physical work, mistress?
A voice timidly asked, from off-screen.
No, Erwin scoffed. I've noticed more than a few of you growing dependent on our Lord's artifacts for your labors. I would be remiss in my duties as your teacher if I failed to correct that failing, lest you prove utterly useless beyond the walls of this.
Jack stopped just in time to avoid bumping into the doors of Lynn's room. Putting the tablet away, content that Elwyn had the former Silver Paw members in hand, as well as her apprentices, he glanced up at the two guards stationed outside, to make sure neither had noticed his faux pas. They hadn't, or at least they were doing an admirable job of pretending they hadn't, by standing at attention, and staring at pretty much anything that wasn't him. Hell, if he didn't know better, he'd say they looked uncomfortable. Which he supposed made sense. He could well see a cultivator acting poorly towards anyone that had seen them embarrass themselves. "Is Lynn in?" he asked, content to let the moment pass by.
"She is,"
the woman on the left answered quickly, her eyes remaining fixed on the far wall.
"Along with Lady Huang."
God, they still sounded nervous, he thought. How bad must cultivators be? Right, well, I'll just be heading in then, he said. Both guards' eyes opened wide and one visibly twitched, but neither said anything. So Jack pulled open the doors, just in time for a rather long, rather feminine moan of pleasure to echo out from inside. A moment of stunned silence followed. He started to close the doors.
"Wait, Jack, this is..."
Lynn's surprised voice started to call out from within the room, accompanied by Huang's gasps. He finished closing the doors. He ignored the blushing of both guards. He walked away. And only once he was down the hall did he whisper quietly to himself, "Christ, I knew they were close, but I didn't think they'd grown that close." He certainly hadn't thought they were both lesbians. Sure, they'd been hanging out a lot, but he thought they were both just close friends. That was the logical assumption. Neither had given him any hints beyond that friendship that they liked women. That was fine, though. Good for them. Two members of his nominal harem liked each other. That was good. He wasn't jealous. Not at all. He already had two women he was with. His ego had not been stung at all. "Speaking of which," he murmured, "I need to find Arn, or Ren, or both." Yes, both sounded good.